Italian section of Greenwich to come into the school, and Mrs. Johnson insists they be allowed in, along with these very wealthy children who come with their governesses and chauffeured in, etc. I think that was probably the breaking, but Mrs. Johnson was so close to May Lanier that she actually dedicates her book, Youth in a World of Men, to May Lanier. But there was a break later, and my supposition is that was what it was about. Well, this was difficult for me to understand until much later in my life, of why Mrs. Johnson had to continue to feel this way about any financial support, that she simply had to have the control. So that drove her out into raising the money herself, and she was determined to keep the school here in Fairhope free to the children of the town. The only children who paid were those who lived in the school home, and they paid handsomely, and they could well afford to, or those who came from out of town and boarded in families, because the school home couldn't accommodate them all. They came from everywhere, including Europe. They also paid a very small tuition to come, and again could afford to. So that is something she believed in deeply, that it was going to be free, and she thought all education in time, of course, should be free, especially if we were going to be taxed for it. Then why shouldn't it be free to all children? But that put a tremendous burden on her. And in spite of the burden, she seemed to have that marvelous ability to raise the monies, and she would come back from these marvelous speaking tours with enough money to build another building. We ended up with 10 beautiful buildings on that campus, and we had excellent faculty. I know that most of the faculty taught for very little. For instance, Charles Raybould, who was a student of Cecil Sharp's, he came to us from Yale with a tremendous salary and left it to come to Marietta Johnson to be her assistant and teach the English folk dance and the English folk song, and he was the one that was so tragically killed in the plane accident. So I do understand that with her, but because of those pressures, I also defend her in that she wrote so little, and in a sense wrote so poorly, and yet was such a magnificent speaker. I want to touch on her two books too, Mark, when we're thinking about her writing. Youth in a World of Men was her first book, and it was written in 1928, published in 1929, and it's, fortunately, the museum has her copy, the first book off the press. Kenny and I had it, and it's gone up to the museum, and it says it's dedicated to her mother, or it's not dedicated to her mother, it's dedicated to May Lanier, but it says, "To Mother with all my heart's love, Marietta Johnson." First book off the press, 1929. That's a real museum piece. Her second book, and I think Youth in the World of Men is excellent, and it's remarkable in that year now, in those years, to think just some of her heading on her chapters of how frank she is, how progressive she is in her thinking. For instance, her first chapter is Whose Responsibility? And she points out the responsibility, now we're talking about education, our parents, and of course, and teachers, and society. The nature and needs of the child, which is very similar to what you would read in Oppenheim and Henderson and Frabel. The third chapter is Fundamental Impulses, and I love that one because she addresses the impulses of children that we so often call naughty and we want to discourage. She talks about the fighting impulse. Children, babies are born not selfish, but self-full, full of self. And that is the first thing that a human being must grow out of, to a sense. And that's really all that kindergarten and nursery school should be, is to make a child realize they're happiest when they're compatible, agreeable, in group. And that starts the thinking of love and companionship. And if you're not full of that, you're not very happy, and that the child soon knows that. And she talks about the playing with guns. She doesn't have any feeling that that should be stopped. She says that's natural to want to play with guns, and that's theatrical, the bang bang and the chasing business. But the important thing there then is to guide the children from never into the war or killing with a gun, and to bring that into submission in time, including aggression, physical aggression. She even says to fight, physically fight children is a very natural impulse and should not be completely killed, but never to let in a group for the adult to be conscious if there's a bully in the group, and of course to stop that. That's where the adult steps in. But that fighting impulse is a natural impulse. Fear is a natural impulse. And these things have to be worked through and out of into a developing wholeness of the right kind of human being. I think today, when you know the world conditions, what is the hope of our children when they are that fighting impulse? We have children now that are into war, killing at the age of 8 and 9 and 10. Now that is a perverted, terrible sense of not growing out of that right impulse. And then she talks about creative work, creative play, wonderful chapters, developing thinking power, discipline. Can morals be taught? Religion in the child. That's a beautiful chapter. What about sex? She's very frank about the sex. Social development. And then she outlines a whole school program of what it should be. It's really a remarkable book. Then her second book, written in 10 years later, and she was writing that book the year of her death, and that's called 30 Years with an Ideal. And I think it has just as much importance and is as good, but the background quickly on that book, it was never edited. And after her death, Ken and I found the manuscript on this book. And it was scribbled on the sides and one thing and another. It's repetitious, but I think it's a wonderful book. So I took it in the early 40s down to the Courier, and I said, look what I have found. And it was one of the Gastons, Francis Gaston Crawford, who was the editor. And I said, Aunt Frankie, this is what we found, and will you print 500 sheets of this for us? The whole thing. And she said, no, but I'll give you, I think she said 50. So she did, and then she let me know she'd come up and have lunch with us at our little business, and she told me they were done. I said, I'll come down and get them, and she said, no, you can't have them, Dot, you're too enthusiastic. You'll give them out promiscuously. I'll give them out. But she gave me several, and I brought one home, and I cut it out very carefully, and I made a leather-bound cover for it. It's, again, a museum piece, and it's there in its entirety. Now, unfortunately, we had a very serious illness come on us a couple of years later with our second son, Jeffrey, so I had to fall out of the picture of any community effort or whatever. But fortunately, first I would say that there are several people here in town who took this manuscript, took it to the University of Alabama Press, and had it printed. Not edited, which is okay by me. However, the preface in it, and if we should ever redo it, I think there should be a preface so stating that it was never edited, and so it is repetitious, and it was just done as we found the old manuscript. Unfortunately, I didn't have the wisdom to get the manuscript itself, so that's been lost to us. But this, we find that educators are very thrilled to find this book. Now, those are the only two books that she wrote. Now, she did write some things that we have in pamphlet form. Not a lot. They bring up when we're in discussion. Don't know how to handle it. Tell me when.